Hey, this is Erdem Menges. I'm VP of Product Marketing at Command Zero, and I have with me Eric today.
Hi, my name is Eric Hulse. I run product research here at Command Zero.
Today, we're going to discuss the tiered versus tierless security operations center approaches, some of the benefits, some of the different structures, and how AI for SOC can help transform security operations centers. Eric, what's a tiered analyst approach in a security operations center?
Tiered analyst approach really is what most SOCs have been working with for a number of years now, where you have the formal processes, formal tiers 1 through 3. Your juniors are handling a lot of your inbound triage. They're escalating up cases that can't either be reduced or filtered out to the more complex analysts. And then they're going up to your more tier 3 for the deep forensics. So those guys are going to be doing deep forensics, threat hunting, and a little bit more nuanced and complex cases. Now, the tiered structure originates and stems from traditional IT before security was a formality, where you had your tier 1 through 3 help desk. Tier 1 would be your traditional help desk, handling and triaging those tickets, working off for standard playbooks, and then escalating things as they became more nuanced to higher skill levels and higher skilled practitioners.
Thank you. And what are the benefits of a tiered approach in a security operations center?
I think there's a number of benefits. First is the formality and the structure, right? You have process, you have continuity, you have all of the content where it's working within those defined bounds. You also have the accountability, because when people have their swim lanes, when the analysts know what they need to do, what their standards are, their workflows, their operations, their practices, they're going to stay within the confines of those. And that backtracks to that accountability. So when a process fails, when a tier fails, where a system goes south, you can actually go back and triage that. You can work through an after action and say, okay, where did we actually fall short in this process? What happened? How do we actually correct this? The other one also obviously comes down to that standardization. Tiered structures or tiered SOCs often have that repeatability, the reliable workflows and the procedures or process. But then most importantly, overlooked too is compliance, right? When you have those tiered SOCs and those tiered structures, the formality lends itself to compliance, because you're going to have a lot of that documentation. You're going to have the auditability and those auditable processes to actually fulfill or at least check that box for compliance.
Where do MDRs and MSSPs fit into this tiered structure?
Yeah, so really where we're seeing a lot of the MDRs and MSSPs fit in a number of ways. There's some of those MSSPs and even MDRs are offering that full spectrum of services. So they're covering and even have that level of formality for tier 1 through 3. I've experienced and seen some of the MSSPs which do provide that full spectrum, full tiered service, and almost everything is completely outsourced. Same with MDRs, right? It just depends on the provider. In other cases, a lot of MDRs and MSSPs are providing that first level, that tier 1 kind of triage and services. So we do see a lot of organizations supplementing or even offshoring 2 things. One, in the entirety is their tier 1 to these MDRs and MSSPs. And in other cases, they're actually utilizing the MDRs and MSSPs to supplement their SOC for the 24/7 type of methodology and coverage, because either they don't have the funding or that around the sun model where they can actually fulfill that.
Thank you. Now I want to switch gears to a slightly different topic, which is about the trend that we're seeing around dissolving tiers in the security operations center. Can you speak to a tierless SOC approach where multiple tiers or levels merge into almost like an horizontal tier?
Sure. The Tierless SOC, there's a couple of drivers behind it. One of the big things that we see with Tierless is there's no kind of defined lineage of responsibilities. So what is really cool about that model of Tierless SOCs is any incident or any investigation is not then passed off or handed off. It's actually taken from start to finish by 1 or 2 analysts to fulfill the entirety of that life cycle of investigation. Now, the Tierless SOCs are also coming about as a result of a lot of MDRs and MSSPs coming in and supplementing a lot of this activity on that tier one level. So organizations are starting to actually have their tier one eroded. And what you're ending up with is more traditional tier two and tier three. Now, either way, when you consider it in the semantics of it, you are still ultimately triaging. So as soon as that hits your organization, whether passing through an MDR or an MSSP, you're still at that first tier of triage, whether we want to call it that or not. That's the reality of what we're seeing. But the Tierless SOC also has its benefits like anything else. We also see it a lot with smaller organizations who don't necessarily have the budget, the resources to equip and formally define that structure of tiers within their SOC.
Yep, thank you. And in your opinion, what are the drivers for this transformation to a tierless SOC? Why are organizations going this route?
There's a number of different reasons. The first and foremost, probably bigger driver is just budget and constraints on personnel. You also have a number of other factors. The inclusion of MDRs and MSSPs, that's eroding your traditional tier one. But we also see a constant issue with personnel turnover, burnout, right? It's rampant within the industry. And one of the things that I've seen over the last 24 years is tiered SOCs and that structure of tiers. It's often very easy to get stuck in place. Organizations don't necessarily have the budget, the investment to be able to formally train and ramp up anyone from tier one to tier two. Inevitably, what ends up happening is they get stuck in their tier one process, their tier two process, wherever it is. And the only way to actually elevate the career is to basically move on. Well, that person that's inbound to the new organization might have just come from a tier one organization and a position where they didn't get the actual training because that company couldn't provide it for them. So job satisfaction becomes one of those areas where it's really kind of a leading indicator. You also have burnout. So burnout contributes heavily to that. You're always going to have the repetitive tasks that often occur within tier one and tier two, especially. I've met many folks who their day in, day out is literally just to handle phishing. And the monotony of the same thing day in, day out when the organization isn't then implementing any type of automation around that, it gets a little tiring. That contributes back to the burnout. Those are some of the factors that we see.
And when you think about some of the benefits and downside, you mentioned analysts being able to tackle more diverse cases and being able to own cases from start to finish, and then maybe going deeper in some cases is good exposure for their career growth. What other benefits and potential downsides do you see by implementing a tierless approach?
One of the benefits is obviously it eliminates the handoff. So you don't have the analyst having to just hand off and it becoming this black hole of invisibility. So they actually get to see it from end to end, process that, and work through the entirety of the investigation. Now, the downside to that is also that you have the same analysts which are working through the entirety of that investigation. So a couple things with that is one, it not necessarily eliminates the need for specialists, but it starts to erode the specialists. So you lose some of that deep visibility and understanding into certain technologies or certain areas of expertise for that investigation. Now, also within that for the organization, one of the downsides is it actually contributes to a higher cost of analysts and a higher ramp up of training costs and things like that. Your analyst then needs to have a full spectrum of understanding and responsibility across a number of different products within the organization. So on a larger org, the more products, the more diversity you have within your product suite, well, the more the analyst actually needs to know. And that really goes down to every single analyst. They're going to have to know about every single one of those products and technologies. They're going to have to be a near expert in network, endpoint, cloud, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the other pros, though, you do now have single accountability layers. Data analyst is responsible for conducting those investigations start to finish. That then contributes or leads to maybe fewer details lost, less time on the handover that would have been lost, because anytime you escalate, you have to go back, say what was done, what wasn't done. Well, if one analyst is actually following that entire process end to end, now you're recouping some of those losses or some of those areas where you would have otherwise lost a lot of time and perhaps some of that context in translation.
Yep. Thank you. Switching the topic to AI for SOC, how do you see AI for SOC helping with this transformation around tiers?
The first and most obvious one is the actual acceleration of automation. So when you consider that tier one is really starting to erode, and even the MDRs and MSSPs that are taking up a lot of that work have a heavy hand in automation and are incorporating a large degree of AI within that. We see AI SOC moving and accelerating at a rapid speed right now. That is going to help eliminate a lot of that bottleneck and repetitive tasks because AI is very capable of doing that. Within that, you're also going to see the supplementation. When you consider an analyst job, when they're not familiar with certain technology, they're going to have to go and dive into it. That requires a traditional sense, a lot of Googling, right? Going through Reddit, going through some of those forums and understanding the context of what they are looking at. Well, the AI, the chatbots, a lot of things like Perplexity and ChatGPT, even Claude, allow for that analyst to quickly grok what they are looking at and then why they need to look at it, how to actually work about investigating it, and quickly ramp up their ability to do that. But I think a large degree of that comes down to that hand in automation.
And I think the need for subject matter expertise covering all of their infrastructure is another area where AI for SOC can be helpful because it can help up-level some of the knowledge that these analysts have and facilitate the sharing of best practices and knowledge within those teams.
And you're always going to need subject matter expertise, regardless of whether tiers exist, whether tiers don't exist. You're always going to need that because there's always going to be nuanced investigation. And there's always going to be, at some point, a need for deep forensics. So you can still have your generalist, you can still have your specialists within each organization and even handing over, but you're always going to need the subject matter expertise because even with the advent of AI and the incorporation thereof, you still have to validate. Right? I come from that background where it's trust but verify. You still have to know enough to leverage this and to actually obtain the full value of that to avoid things like hallucinations, which are decreasing, but they still exist.
Yep, absolutely. And right now we have some organizations who are sticking with the tiered approach, other organizations who may be going with a tierless SOC analyst approach. What's next for the tiering structure for security operations centers?
For organizations that are capable, have the budget, have the hiring capacity, they're going to continue with a level of structured tiers. But those would be organizations that benefit from all of those and then also require the compliance, the standardization, but they have the money, they have the ability to invest in people, grow them, and actually support a progressive path through those tiered structures. Smaller organizations, they're going to continue struggling and you're going to see full outsourcement for small business. You're going to continue seeing on the medium side, the erosion of tier one, just because of the volume, the deluge of alerts, the volume that they're dealing with and their inability to not only obtain, but then train and retain some of that expertise and the subject matter experts within the industry. So the erosion of tier one, I think you'll continue to see. And then you'll see an amalgamation of those tier twos and tier threes. They'll work through. Some of them will find great success in a tierless model. Others, they're going to have to really work through that and figure out how that's going to look and how they implement more structure into tier two and three as they continue to grow and expand.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.